and good evening. It's Wednesday. It's the Dark Ozarks.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hey, Josh. Hey, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great Wednesday.
I am digging your shirt.
Oh, thank you. New Dark Ozarks design.
Oh, by Darren Amstead, Savage Gear Design and Branson. Looks absolutely fantastic. Cannot wait to get mine. In the meantime,
Yes, you do.
I'm 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 over here shilling for Screaming Eagle at Six Flags.
I see that.
Unrelated subject. I am personally convinced that Six Flags St. Louis is haunted. It's one of the reasons I love going there.
You're not the only person I've heard say that. So.
Sometime I'll write a book. It's a neat place. But speaking of neat places, we have an amazing sponsor to talk about in Joplin, Missouri.
We do. Always buying books. 5357 North Main in Joplin. Yes, and you have fresh material from there.
I do. Great experience. We shot a short live from Always Buying Books here a couple of weeks ago. Fantastic experience. Love getting to meet Bob and Elise, and loved browsing. The place is a TARDIS. The building is larger on the inside than it is on the outside. I don't know how that works, and
it's magic.
It is magic, and of course, magic is our topic for tonight. But Bob weaves a very special magic in terms of his book curation. There's been, it's not. I love bookstores. That's just the reality of it. Really do. But being able to go into a bookstore that it's very evident that the folks, the owners, really put a high standard in terms of curation, because now I've never run a bookstore. I know that you have a lot of experience in terms of dealing with books.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to conjecture something. I don't know this, unrelated to anything except books, but I'm going to conjecture that if you hang out your shingle and say, I'm selling books or I'm accepting books, that it's probably very easy to get mounds of books that are really nobody wants.
Yes.
And much more difficult to get quality collections that are valued
yes.
to the public.
It is a process, and it's an art form, and the thrill is in the hunt. I will be honest, and if he's being honest, Bob will say the same. So
I think that's very, very fair. And he does a fantastic job. That was something. There is a very wide selection. There's children's books, there's romances, there's thrillers, there's, lots and lots of fiction as well. I tend to get really excited about the nonfiction. No big surprise there. And the quality of, for example, American history or occult or European history or world history. Very, very high quality selections, and some really fantastic prices as well.
Yes. And so anyone, if you're in the area, go by, shop, tell them that Josh and Lisa sent you. And
Yes.
If you can't get by, find them online at alwaysbuyingbooks.net, as well as on Facebook, Always Buying Books, and as well as their group, friends who like Always Buying Books. And they put inventory for sale in there, so you can purchase and have it mailed to you. And you can call them up and say, hey, I'm looking for this. And if they've got it, they will hook you up with it.
That's fantastic. Mm-hmm. That's something else that I think is really important. And of course, we have the opportunity to practice this with you all, with the viewers, and something that I work regularly to curate for myself. I know you do as well. But in doing business or in interacting, engaging with folks who have personal vested interest, and that you can have that kind of dialogue.
Yes.
It makes a world of difference as we go about our lives. And that's something that I love about always buying books, and it's something that I love on the recipient side, because folks, you all, so many of you, contact us with your experiences, your stories, dark history, paranormal, etc. And we love hearing from you.
We do. Makes our job wonderful and fulfilling, and that's why we do this. So
it is it's creating community, obviously, and in a location that, or in a genre that oftentimes doesn't necessarily foster community, because it's a little bit to the, traditionally, or for sort of mid-century on in America, is a little bit on the outside, and it's one of the things I love about it.
It really is, and what I love is it just we've been able to demonstrate what a broad interest there is, and that there really is a large community interested in the material, and so it doesn't get better than that.
It really doesn't. And a lot of times people are interested because they've had experiences that they cannot explain.
Exactly. And I think and what I find is sometimes we're able to put people in touch with each other that had similar experiences, and we've seen that the result, and it's a good one.
It is a good one. Very, very quickly. Also sponsored by Always Buying Books. In October, Dark Ozarks, Paranormal Science Lab, State of the Ozarks, all coming together for an in-person event in Joplin.
Yes, October Country will be held at the VFW Post 534 on Main Street in Joplin. It's going to be an all-day event. We're going to touch on a lot of different topics that come under the umbrella of Dark Ozarks. And come on out, enjoy. You get to participate. This is not us being talking heads. We don't like that. And, we don't like to do that anyway. And you can go to the Paranormal Science Lab website or the Dark Ozarks Facebook page and get your tickets, and just come out and have a good time.
Absolutely. Make plans now. Get in your calendar. Check out Dark Ozarks, and we hope to see you there. Now, black magic.
Yes.
It is an interesting, at the very least, to me, it's an incredibly interesting subject, and I think it elicits a lot of emotion.
It does. I think that there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction that, oh my, this, evil, bad. I don't want anything, I don't want anything to do with this. Some people to the point of I don't want to hear about it, as if it's going to rub off. And but I think by nature is something that people are fascinated with, the concept.
I agree. I also think, and you hit on something that is important to understand. Peripherally knowing about black magic, and in this case, perhaps indigenous black magic. We're going to talk a lot about Cherokee black magic in particular, is not something that you're not going to, walk down the sidewalk, trip on a rock and fall into being a sorcerer.
That, or being cursed, or by hearing information. No. On the other hand, like so many things, information can be useful, and so if you actually are in situations that it might be employed, it might be a good idea to have a little bit of framework to know what situation you're stepping into.
I think that's a very valid point. It's being completely ignorant of something that is a potential threat, and I think it's fair to say that the very concept of black magic is that it is being used to exert a negative a negative occurrence. I think that would be perhaps the broadest definition of black magic. We'll get into some of the gray ethics It depends on, who is the practitioner, who is the practitioner. I just made that up. But
You sound like a lawyer there.
little
Must be the company you're keeping.
I'm good with that. I'm very good with that.
Okay.
Is that there's it's it is by its very essence interesting, juicy, and a little scary, because we're dealing with unseen forces or esoteric application. We're dealing with the occult, in the definition that the occult is hidden knowledge, and
Exactly.
that and of course there's a lot of emotional, religious responses to that. But at this point, just strip all of that away for a moment and focus on the reality that the term occult simply means hidden knowledge. That's its most basic definition.
Exactly. Someone knowing something that most people don't, and that it can work to their advantage, I think is sort of the most basic concept of it.
And to my knowledge, I think would be fair to say that nearly all traditionalist societies, pre-industrialized societies, have a magic tradition. And I think it's also very important to separate out the most of what we're talking about, if not all of it, is going to be referencing traditional European, traditional First Nation, Cherokee, as well as West African and Haitian or Santo Domingan traditions. And this is largely, if not exclusively, separate from post-1950s Satanism.
Yes. 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 And never the twain shall meet, so to speak.
And it's understanding, to me anyway, understanding that there is a long tradition of socio-historical context to these practices is very, very helpful, as well as understanding that how you use magic. I think it's fair to say that if the recipient of the magic, if it's harming them or attempting to harm them, their conclusion is that it's black magic. But that's more a definition in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, perspective can be everything in these things. I mean, what is black magic or quote evil from one perspective can be protection and defensive from another. And I think that's the danger with these very vague labels, is that people put a lot of contextual meaning on this very vague label, and then the real world circumstances are never that easy.
No. No. Now, just from your experience and your perspective,
the most basic definition, I would say, is having an inordinate effect upon events or people that ordinarily would not happen.
Yes. And I think that's quite fair. And when you separate that out just for a moment, this is kind of moving away from the quote unquote black magic part, but exerting the capacity to exert and or create things, make things happen in sometimes uncanny ways, it sometimes can manifest itself in ways that people would not associate with, like, say, pop culture images of witchcraft.
Right. I'd agree.
That can be often, not negative, but that there's always a little bit of an edge. Like, how did that happen? How did that person manage to do that? It is associated with occult knowledge in the most literal sense. The idea that some people know something about something that other people do not.
Right.
But then there's,
I would say, think of it as, luck, whether good or bad, but not just by random chance that someone has somehow affected things to create that situation.
essentially, and I think the English word luck is a very effective one in this. The idea of having some sort of manifestation process, for example, to give yourself positive luck, or to give someone else positive luck, or to do the opposite.
Exactly. I agree.
Now, getting into, there's a little bit of a shift here, getting into Cherokee Black Magic, our primary source citation is The Night Has a Naked Soul, Witchcraft and Sorcery Among the Western Cherokee by Alan Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick is an anthropologist whose direct ancestral line includes Cherokee. He grew up in northeastern Oklahoma and written, I'm assuming, multiple scholarly pieces. This book is the one that we have. It was published in the 1970s. And not the easiest read. It is quite academic.
It is academic, but it is nice in that there are personal experiences used to illustrate things, so that for the layperson who is not doesn't have much foundation in this information, I think they still can get a lot out of it. And I do commend him on that. It was well done.
I agree. It is an excellent book. I think that for the layperson who might be really interested in it, highly recommend picking up a copy if you can find one. That said, with the title, The Night Has a Naked Soul, Witchcraft and Sorcery Among the Western Cherokee, there is this implication, or this inference, that it's going to be super juicy, and maybe you're going to learn some cool practices and that sort of thing. And you're going through page after page of phonetic Cherokee language. And you're like, this is an effort, and but I love that about it.
Me too, and I think if you apply yourself and get through it, it's well worth the experience.
It is. Now, of course, that's what a lot of our research leanings on the subject is what we're going to be talking about. The Cherokee concept, and many of the First Nation peoples of the Oklahoma region concept of witchcraft, is a bit different from Northern European or European concepts.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, there are a few aspects that are reminiscent, but not. And I would say that if you want to make a comparison, there is more of a comparison to be made to voodoo practitioners than to European traditions. And actually that really does make sense, because voodoo originated out of Western Africa and into the Caribbean, and absorbed, was influenced by native practices there. Then when they got to the Low Country and the Carolinas and so forth, and Georgia, they again, the slaves had a rapport with a lot of the Indians, and so there was an exchange of information. So it makes sense that they kind of borrowed from each other at that point.
And that, I think, is particularly interesting, as well as the long-standing historical concern that, especially in the aforementioned, the Carolinas and Georgia and Florida, appears to have been a long-standing historical concern that the slaves and the Indians would get together.
Yeah, I mean
and unite.
That was a fear, yes.
And of course, in the on the ground conflict, predominantly against the Seminole in Florida, that was actually happening.
Yeah, it did happen, and so it just makes sense that when you look at some of these things, you see some similarities.
And that, it's one of those things that you really, at this juncture point, it's very difficult to parse out some of the traditions, because very few, if anyone, was recording the processes of that cross-cultural pollination of practice and idea.
Yeah, neither side was taking detailed notes on that.
No. Now, something that is, to me, really fascinating, but also chilling in terms of Cherokee, and not limited to Cherokee, but we'll be talking predominantly about that based on the source citation. Response to Black witchcraft is the idea that witches, I'm going to throw this out here just as a point of comparison. Witches in a through the lens of Catholicism, through the lens of Protestantism in Northern and Central Europe and the British Isles, a witch was almost exclusively an adult female, an adult woman. And a witch was someone who had sold her soul to Satan from a church standpoint, not from a on the ground standpoint, not from a reality of what many indigenous people, particularly of Celtic, Italian, and German traditions, were doing, but certainly how they were being viewed by the individuals who were putting them on trial.
Right.
Interestingly enough, and as horrifying as that is, they at no point, to my knowledge, did the church say that this human being who's before us isn't a human being. The argument was it was a human being who had gone to the dark side, so to speak.
Gone to the dark side or was possessed. I mean, there were those accusations too, possessed by demons and forced to practice witchcraft. But it was all more of a relinquishing of free will of some sort.
Yes.
By bargain or involuntarily. Whereas the idea of shape-shifting in that European tradition was more reserved for the idea of vampires and werewolves and things like that. And more along the lines of, in some sense, being the victims of witchcraft or something, starting that process, being cursed. And so now you are a shifter.
Against your will.
Against your will, unless you made a bargain, but typically it was, against your will. But it was a very visible manifestation of, here's the consequences of witchcraft. Whereas you don't have that dividing line so much in a lot of the Native American lore.
No, and something, again, one of the very, to me, fascinating, sometimes entertaining, sometimes very chilling facets of, the way that the Black magic practitioners are regarded, the way that quote unquote witches are regarded in this traditional Cherokee lore, is that they're not human, and they are meant to be killed.
Yes. Yeah, that through their practice or something they've done, that basically they are no longer human. In some cases, they are shapeshifters. But it's more the change in the fundamental essence of the person themselves.
Yes. And I do find this really fascinating. So we have this situation where killing a witch isn't murder because they're not a human.
That's true. It makes it nice and convenient, because then you don't have to think about those things. Whereas, some of the contrivances in the European witch trials were almost as laughable. I mean, to be perfectly honest. I mean,
yeah.
The trial, you'd have trial by dunking and so forth. And, if you drowned, you were innocent.
Convenient.
Yeah, but if you didn't, you were guilty. So now we're going to kill you. So, which ironically, again, the outcome is the suspicion. It was the worst part, because in essence, for the most part, you're going to die whether you're found guilty or innocent. And in the native tradition, in the Cherokee tradition, the suspicion is the moniker of determining whether you're going to kill them.
Yes.
Not a finding of guilt.
Yes. Kilpatrick notes a personal recollection near the end of the book, in which he's actually taken to the very isolated grave of a long dead family member, and then told she was a witch, and essentially that she had lived and then ultimately died in as much isolation as the community could create.
Right. Ostracized.
And very much ostracized. And that there was, just that sense of dread that seemed to hang around the idea.
And that, and if I recall correctly, almost that somehow she was still a threat even after being dead for 100, 150 years.
That there was a danger.
Yeah.
That danger existed throughout the generations and across time and space as well, which I think is an ultimate fear in the idea that this is a cross time and space danger, that the bad things in the dark can get you no matter what you do.
It is. It's reminiscent of stories of the undead. Things coming back from the grave to torment or kill the villagers from Europe.
Yes,
it's a similar idea anyway.
It is, and then in terms of the the familiar or the social aspect, the concept, the Cherokee concept of witches, again, that a witch isn't exactly human. It may appear, I think that's a good term. It may appear as an adult male, as an adult female, as a child of either gender. It could appear a lot of different ways. And then also being associated with a raft of animals that there is some question: is the animal the witch? Is the animal essentially what we would call in European tradition a familiar? It might be either, it might be both. There's a great deal of ambiguity.
Yeah. And and here's something I'm going to throw at you, see what you think. It just came to my mind. This kind of analysis, this kind of viewing of this is kind of reminiscent of what is actually happening currently in the field of paranormal enthusiasm, of the idea that a spirit can take on all of these different attributes.
Interesting.
Can appear as, something other than it is. And any which way it may appear as a child or a woman or a man, or deceiving in its attitude, that kind of thing. And you see that a lot. And I find over the last 20 years, I hear that people saying that more, as far as worrying that, oh, this isn't, whatever you're encountering really isn't what you're encountering.
Yes.
And what do you think sociologically, from the sociological perspective, what pushes that fear?
Oh, I think that's a good question. The thing that comes to mind initially for me is, once you step into the realm of the paranormal, there is a great deal of ambiguity, because you're no longer dealing with the physical.
Right.
And at that point, sometimes your guesses are right, and sometimes your guesses are not right. But the mind has to fill in a lot of gaps. It essentially has to interpolate the data and hope for the best. That interpolation is an area that often gets mistaken for fact.
That's true. And really, when you think about this concept of the witch as not being human, it's really analogous to that. So
It is.
A bit of what we're seeing now in the paranormal field may be exactly, the same kind of thought process that happened for hundreds of years in the native tradition.
I would say that is very fair, and I'm also going to posit, and this gets into some sociological issues that may get something thrown at me, but I'm just going to forge forward, because and my reasoning on this is that sociological or cultural or pop cultural influences vastly influence our interpretations more than we like, or oftentimes more than we assume. And and we've talked about this, after beginning with the Exorcist film. All the paranormal experiences are suddenly demonic.
Yeah.
I love the Conjuring series, but it's not all a demonic Romanian nun. It really isn't. I know we're all a fan of Valak, but it ain't that kind of thing. And it's and certainly a little bit of a tangent here, but the idea that, for example, the stuff getting moved around in the old building probably isn't a terrifying demonic manifestation. It literally could be the spirit of Uncle Fred who's bored.
Yeah.
And
never overestimate the power of boredom in eternity.
No, exactly. And and if he liked to screw with you in real life and play practical jokes, it's quite possible that he's still doing the same thing in many situations. It's not that big of a deal. And while there are spiritual apex predators, they are about as rare in terms of occurrence as regular non-spiritual, fully corporeal apex predators. Yes, you're going to be at the ocean. There's a possibility that you'll be fully consumed by a great white shark. The likelihood of that happening, however, is really, really low.
Yeah, same. I mean, not too many people are killed by a polar bear. No. It is the same thing. I agree with you there. I think another thing that I find really interesting is the idea, and we've alluded to this, but the actual, the transformation,
Yes.
the notion of transformation with all of this. And one that I find interesting, and it's there are tales of it in the lowlands, in the low country, as well as the Cherokee lore in Oklahoma, of witches traveling as orbs of light.
I find this really interesting. Now I'm going to counter this and say, you've seen a spook light multiple times. Do you think it's a witch?
No.
Okay. I don't either, but I cannot help but read those descriptions and see a similarity.
Yes.
Just in terms of the visual description, which I find fascinating.
Well, I mean, I do too, and it certainly, that certainly came to my mind. But no, I do not get that feeling. But if, of course, I also look at it that if you were going to transform to travel, why would you turn into something that would look out of place?
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Now, now there are tales of in a lot of native traditions of basically different names, but basically night walkers who would turn into animals to travel fast and also supernaturally fast, faster than the animals could travel themselves.
Yes.
And I do find that interesting.
There's I've got a couple of not my personal experiences, but recollection stories that have been shared with me.
Uh-huh.
One of them was acquaintance who's quite reliable.
Mm-hmm.
And I really should sit down with him and actually get something recorded, because this was just a in passing conversation. Barbershop was what this was. But he was driving in Oklahoma in the dark, and a coyote-like animal figure, but with unnaturally long limbs and attributes that would be associated with a human.
Yes.
Leaped over his vehicle and then ran alongside the vehicle at the same speed for a short period of time before going off into the dark.
And we've had other stories just like that shared with us. So
yes,
and not just in Oklahoma either.
No.
And so often, the Cherokee response would be that was probably a witch.
Yes. Whatever it was, it would have to be unbelievably unsettling.
Definitely. And often, I've also heard accounts like that of coming across this kind of creature and the face not looking right. I mean, and not just that it didn't look like a canine per se, but like there was something misshapen or something, and the being told that, oh, that means that you caught it in the midst of shifting.
Also unsettling.
Yes.
What
it's like, oops. It's like, oh, we freeze.
I think there's a Bugs Bunny episode like that.
Yes.
I really think there is. Now, there is obviously a very strong post-industrialization, post-modern push to say anything like this, witchcraft, shape-shifting, conjures, black magic, this is primitive superstition. It was all mistaken for something else. If you are an intelligent, modern person, you do not ascribe to any of this, because it doesn't and cannot exist.
Exactly, because it does not conform to normal rules of physics.
Right.
Of course, quantum physics is starting to push those limits in ways that make it a little more uncomfortable because, when you start talking about, spooky entanglement at distance and that kind of thing, you know, teleportation, those kind of things, it starts sounding like we're going in a circle.
Yes, yes.
So,
And we may be.
and maybe, and in part, to be perfectly honest, these things may be a matter of tapping into those very empirical concepts and not approaching it from that point, but actually affecting those concepts.
Yes. Now, I'm going to jump to, I'm going to make this comparatively ambiguous. I'm just going to say that this was it is a recorded story that I have on file. Wow, 6 years ago. And very, very interesting, but I'm not going to name names. We'll just say in the Ozarks, in Missouri Ozarks. This was a story that was recorded because I don't have official permission from the folks, but it is woman who was sharing about her grandmother, and her grandmother had done some time. We'll leave it at that. And then also had traveled to New Orleans and spent a lot of time in New Orleans studying voodoo.
Okay.
And then came back home to the Missouri farm. And so this was recollections. The person I interviewed was a little girl at the time. Her grandmother comes home and then is living with them.
Okay.
And then later, after her grandmother sort of got her feet under her financially, moved a short ways away into a small house. And she was afraid of her grandmother, and noticed a lot of what would be classified as black magic traditions.
Okay.
The one of the more unsettling ones was it was not unusual for her to, for example, like to go over to her grandmother's house, to be sent over for something, and find her grandmother with all of the curtains pulled, sitting in as much darkness as possible, candles lit on the floor, in a seated position or kneeling position on the floor, and non-responsive to anyone, including her granddaughter.
Okay. Catatonic. Okay.
And then shared that there was a situation in which the neighbors, I believe the neighbors' dogs, got into their cattle, and it wasn't good. There was an altercation. There was conflict between them and the neighbor, so on and so forth. The neighbor said that they weren't going to pay for the losses, that sort of thing. And then maybe two weeks later, neighbor walks out into his field, dies of a heart attack.
Which, could be coincidence, as you said earlier, is it coincidence or is it something else?
Yeah. And the person I interviewed believed that it was not coincidence.
And that's one of those things is that those things you can't ever empirically prove per se.
No.
I was actually having a conversation this morning with a friend who, as she said, I've learned to listen to my intuition more as I've gotten older, and have found out when I pay attention that it is usually right. And so you do have to wonder.
You do. And that from a sort of a yin and yang perspective, on sort of three sides to this. On one side, you can say, well, that's all preposterous. It was just a series of coincidences, like
Right.
Lemony Snicket, a series of unfortunate events, and there's nothing to see here.
Move along.
Yes, move along. There is the aspect that from the practitioner standpoint, it was justice, if it is
Right.
indeed real. This was, me and mine have been harmed, and there does not seem to be a clear path of justice, a clear path of retribution that is workable. And so we're going to exact justice.
Yeah. And again, it comes down to perspective.
It does. Now, the one that might be perhaps most concerning is we view the lens of black magic and witchcraft and relation, historical record, that someone in the village has initiated a panic because something bad has happened, and then they blame the poor ostracized person on the edge of town,
right? Because
they're primitive people and they are prone to panic. And I'm not saying that's not possible, because that's very possible. It's very possible with modern day people as well. On the other hand, what if, say, 1 out of 10 cases that they were right?
Exactly. Or even 1 out of 100. I mean,
yes.
you just don't know. And that is the thought that is very unsettling to most people.
Yes, it is. The idea that you just don't know.
Well, and a lot of people just have a very hard time accepting that, that risk, that possibility is even there, that it's not a nice little box I can wrap up and put a bow on.
Correct. Correct. And the ambiguity, the non-corporeal ambiguity of that reality, and the fact that I think the most concerning thing is the idea that you have to discern the situation in that moment on a case-by-case basis on the ground when there could be a threat.
Right. And that's not a skill that is equalized through the population.
It is not. I think it is comparatively rare skill. The fact that we do decry these ideas of black magic as fiction has made it an even more difficult skill, because we have no framework or context to understand it. And it also really highlights, and something I'm going to throw out here, this is just conjecture on my part, but something I'm going to throw out with the Cherokee, Western Cherokee belief structure about witches being non-human is, I think it's easy to decontextualize that in the reality that Cherokee healers, shamans, individuals who worked magic, and individuals who walked between worlds, individuals who understood how things worked, were also understood to be commonplace and were part of the community.
That's true. That it was not a rare, it was not that rare of an occurrence.
No. And so you did have a traditionalist framework to understand this is conjuring or magic, or supernaturally derived information that is coming from a safe source, coming from a protective source, coming from individuals who have been highly trained in this, as opposed to what the Cherokee appeared to really classify as a deeply deviant version of that.
Yeah. exactly. You had both aspects, and sort of that rogue element is what they strove to stamp out by, killing suspicious human.
Yes. And another thing that is noted in the book, and I think it's fair to take into consideration, was that the Western Cherokee had been extraordinarily displaced.
Yes.
By having arrived in Oklahoma. They were a people that were in dispute with one another, as well as in dispute with other Native American groups, and then also in both conflict and in allies with various factions of the whites.
Yes, very, very, very true. And a good example of that with the Western Cherokee was the interactions between them and the Osage.
Yes.
It was not pretty, and that part of it predated a lot of white intervention, but some of the Cherokee had started moving west before formalized displacement in the 1830s, and in fact, one thing that happened that most people don't think about is that the federal government actually took action to try to protect the Cherokee from the Osage before Andrew Jackson's relocation policy. And so you have a lot of this dynamic came into play in dealing with those kind of situations as well. That the line started being blurred of what was acceptable practice, what was black magic, and in dealing with some of these very real situations that they were encountering with other tribes.
Yes.
And over time, decisions were made of what do we accept, what do we not, and what do we condone.
Yes. And in varying degrees, the fact that simply being, in some cases, violently uprooted from their ancestral lands, and move forcibly. I think there's a certain mirroring between that and many of the West African people who were stolen and shipped across the Atlantic, in the sense that traditions in some cases became acontextual, but these were peoples in crisis at this point that we get to them, that's now very historical, where we're dealing with people who were obviously in physical crisis, but they're also in cultural crisis, in the sense that they were doing their best to retain their traditions, their religion, their culture, in an environment that was actively working against it.
Exactly. And I think that's a really valid point that people don't take into account when they just talk about these subjects. And that certainly affected both groups. And I think you can, and in that way, it is kind of ironic, interesting that there is similarity with those belief structures in both groups. But again, they were going through somewhat similar upheaval.
They were. And not to put too fine of a point on it, but there was certainly, some Scots Irish that were in a less than favorable position when they washed up on the Atlantic seaboard, so to speak.
That's true. That's true. Not exactly as forcibly removed, but certainly in context of what was happening socially and economically, not having a whole lot of choices.
No, not having. And the similarity we see with the development of hoodoo, which there are clear elements, jumping subjects a little bit, that it's close enough that I don't think it matters. Just in terms of our topic for tonight, is that there are extremely valid ancestral lines to West Africa, to hoodoo. There are also, as you noted, very valid ancestral lines to a number of Native American peoples to hoodoo, particularly in terms of finding and identifying analogous roots and plants. That the plants that were used for ritual purposes, for black magic, for non-black magic, for healing, that each people, European peoples and the West African peoples getting to the United States region at that time were looking, there weren't the same plants. North America has some crossover in terms of flora, but not a 1-to-1 ratio. And they often turned to the indigenous peoples, who, interestingly enough, had their own compendiums of ritual and healing herbs that in some cases were pretty close crossover in terms of families of plants and then their uses. But then you also have an ancestral line that ties to essentially the village cunning men and cunning women of Europe, and particularly Britain, all tying together to create a uniquely fusion practice called hoodoo that in this particular form isn't elsewhere outside of North America.
Very true. And we might talk about that murder case out of St. Louis.
Absolutely.
I think it's a good, kind of gives a flavor for what we're talking about.
It really does. And of course, this is from the St. Louis Republic in 1904, with a headline that says murder was a hoodoo. In this case, hoodoo is a noun, not a verb.
Right. A practitioner was called a hoodoo.
A hoodoo. And it's, it's effective use of on the ground language, that a hoodoo practices hoodoo and can be hoodooed if they are not careful.
Exactly. Repetition drilling the point home.
Yes. So I would love to dig more into this because of the location in particular. St. Charles, Missouri.
Yeah.
Testimony in the trial of Price Edwards, a Negro who was convicted of murder in the first degree here last week. And please bear in mind, for anybody who wonders, I'm reading the article that was as it was written in 1904.
Right. So it was written contemporaneous to the events.
Yes. Reveals the fact that old-time Negroes of the country around St. Charles are still believers in many of the quaint superstitions and customs that prevailed among members of their race before the Civil War. So it's the contemporary opinions are definitely showing in 1904. This is now, just as a little bit of context, this is also the same year that St. Louis hosted the exposition, simply the World's Fair, of which there's still a few bits and pieces left, historic structures around downtown St. Louis. And interestingly enough, because of its unique American boosterism culture and style, it was combined with the one and only Olympic Games that the International Olympic Committee refused to recognize.
Yes. And the stadium for those Olympic Games is still on the campus of Washington University.
Is it? I did not realize that. Wow.
Yeah, I drove past it every day going to law school.
How is it
Small.
Is it? Yeah.
I mean, in comparison to our idea of stadiums today, it's something that a good sized high school or a small college might have.
Wow. Yeah. It's still a lot of history. Very, very cool. Also, there's a couple of things just to contextualize the 1904 World's Fair and unrecognized Olympic Games. Is that really was at the time St. Louis was trying to make a name for itself in competition with the Columbian Exposition of 1894, I believe, 1893. They were aiming, the in Chicago, the great White City, which was pretty magnificent. Now, as a tie-in, if I remember correctly, the German candy store in Alton,
came from there.
It came from Chicago, correct?
No, from the World's Fair in St. Louis.
Came from the World's Fair. Okay, yeah. I was trying to. I knew there was a World's Fair involved. Yes, so it did not have as far. So, okay, quick historic aside. Then we'll get into the hoodoo murder. The 1904 World's Fair and unrecognized Olympics was a World's Fair that really was designed to appeal to the everyman of the region and the era. It was not nearly as high-minded as many of the industrial, the international industrial magnates of the East Coast had envisioned with the concept of World's Fairs, but it had left an indelible mark on America. In some ways better than others. I'm not sure exactly what all was reasons for the IOC to decry the 1904 Olympics. One of them might have been the imported pygmy mud wrestling. That was the thing.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Was a thing. But I cannot be too angry at the 1904 World's Fair because they also gave us frozen custard and waffle cones.
Yes.
Introduced frozen custard and waffle cones into American society, and I've been grateful ever since. So in downtown Alton, Illinois, which is just across the river from it, has incredible history, incredibly haunted, and incredible history, incredible Civil War history.
Yes,
is a beautiful Bavarian two-story structure with wood from the Black Forest.
Yeah, black oak.
And it was brought in and assembled for the St. Louis 1904 World's Fair, and then Alton got it shortly thereafter. Now, Hollister, where I'm in, a long ways away from St. Louis, obviously, especially a really long ways away from St. Louis in 1904, shares a little bit of connection with the 1904 World's Fair because the main pavilion, the pavilion or the exposition space for the state of Maine that was set up was a beautiful Adirondack style, what do you call it? Massive multi-story lodge. Lodge.
Yeah, I'd say lodge probably.
And has what was quite impressive, and was built of Maine pine that was brought in for that. And then when so much of the World's Fair was disassembled at the end of it, there were some business folks in Hollister or in the Hollister area that managed to get it, and they took it apart, numbered it, put it on a train. It shows up in present day Branson, but there's no bridge, there's no rail bridge across the White River to where it was going, which was actually College at School of the Ozarks. And the Point Lookout location, which is 4 miles from my house. They unloaded everything and then brought it by wagon and mule down to the ferry, loaded it on the ferry in chunks,
Ferried it across.
ferried it across, back on the mule-drawn wagons, up the hills, and then reassembled it to create essentially one of the main buildings for School of the Ozarks, in about where the Ralph Foster Museum stands today, overlooking the White River Valley. I'm a little confused at this point, but apparently they did put it together the same way that they took it apart, because they had leftover lumber. And that is a good thing, because that leftover lumber made its way into two homes, the Kite Home and the cottage house next to the Kite Home, which is two of the oldest homes in Hollister, Missouri.
That's a lot of extra lumber.
It is. It is. I'm envisioning a full wing. I know. I'm envisioning that there was a wing of the lodge that just didn't make it up the hill. I don't know.
We'll leave that on the wagon.
Yeah. Or possibly there was a lumber tax for the ride up. We will just take that. I don't. I need to find some more records. The lodge burned about 10 years later. Mm-hmm. However, both of those homes made from that main lumber that was brought to the 1904 World's Fair, both of those homes are still standing and are still being used as residences. And yeah. I saw both of them this afternoon when I shot a video.
Awesome. Oh, fantastic.
Oh, so I think it's fascinating. It makes me wonder how many other little bits and pieces of history from the World's Fair, the 1904 World's Fair, scattered across the region.
I'm sure there are others. I just don't know what they are. Yeah.
Yeah, same. So back to our hoodoo murder in 1904. Where do you want to begin with this?
I was fascinated with the testimony against him.
Okay. Now I have the documents in front of me that said you have a lot more courtroom experience than I do.
Well, I was just very curious. Basically that the main witness against him, at least in this regard, was another hoodoo.
Yes.
And I just always found it very interesting, because the tenor of what you get there is that there was animosity between them. And so typically, I hear objections as to bias and so forth, but it seems like that the testimony was believed that he really was a hoodoo, and certainly seemed to inflame the opinions of the jury.
Yes,
is the tenor that I got, that you just really wondered if that was self-serving on the witness's part.
True. And it does speak into that contextual aspect, that that there's, first of all, you take a step away from, is it good magic or is it bad magic? It's magic or practice being used to do a thing. Mm-hmm. And you have in some cases one side trying to do one thing, another side trying to do another thing, or to counter what is being done.
That, plus, just to be on a very practical standpoint, you've got two hoodoos in town, and if you eliminate one, the other one, his business goes up.
This is very, very true. It's so the most interesting one set forth, and the one surrounded by the most mystery, is that of the hoodoo. Edwards, the convicted man, is believed to be a genuine hoodoo, and the sentence condemning him to death, strange as it may seem, is received by the African American community with delight. Philip Hubbard on the witness stand swore to Edward's uncanny powers and asserted that it was by his using them, the powers, that Henderson and Castillo, the others implicated in the murder of Joe Buckner, were influenced to assist in the crime. Henderson had been convicted and Castillo died awaiting trial.
Yeah. And so that gives you a flavor that these kind of topics could have, potentially could have affected the outcome of this man's murder trial in similar ways as inflamed passions affected things in Salem.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yes.
know, and over 200 years later. To me, it also demonstrates that, one, certainly the idea of hoodoo being practiced, did not fade away after the Civil War necessarily, but also that the social fear of it was still there latently, just like at Salem, you had this, inflamed passions that led to this atrocity, even though witch hunts and witch trials were basically almost a thing of the past already elsewhere.
Yes. So Hubbard, who was on the witness stand, claims himself to be a hoodoo, as you mentioned, and told the following interesting story of how the exalted position of hoodoo may be attained. Hoodoos are born, not made. The first and all important thing is to discover the proper herbs from which one may gain the power. The herbs are not the same for any two persons. I think that's a little bit of obfuscation. That's just me.
Yeah.
The search for the proper ones often consumes many years investigation. When the herbs are found, they must be dug from the ground with great secrecy and ceremony. Again, strongly alluding to the occult nature.
Yes, secret knowledge, hidden knowledge.
It is just my conjecture. Obviously, there with folk magic practice, there is a lot of variance. Mm-hmm. From location to location, from person to person. I do think that there's a bit of obfuscation in this testimony, in the same thing that basically saying that the power is real, but nothing is the same from person to person. So don't ask about it.
Don't ask about it, and it's another way that it's hidden knowledge is that you have to discover it yourself, and my power is different than this guy's power, but it also is a way to say implicitly to most people, you don't have that power, so come to me.
Yes, for it. Yes, there. I've got the monopoly, and and my competitor doesn't.
Especially now.
Especially after the execution.
Yeah.
And then it goes into the story of the toe ball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's interesting. It says, then it is necessary to get a piece of the clothing worn by the person whom you wish to place under your spell. This done, the herbs are wrapped in the clothing, which makes the toe ball. And in case anybody's wondering, toe is it like a towboat, not toe as in your big toe. You're then ready to work your spell, which is done by approaching the victim and staring at him with all your powers. He will then quickly yield to your spell and become hoodooed. He then must do your will unless the charm is removed by a hoodoo doctor, very few of whom exist. If the spell is not removed and the victim does not
And so, when they're saying a doctor, meaning, a hoodoo doctor, a voodoo doctor, someone that even a more specialized hoodoo, basically.
And that it is remarked that Castillo, the accomplice of Edwards, died of consumption while awaiting his trial.
Yeah.
There's a lot to get into here. I mean, it's not a long article. There's a lot of bits and pieces that I'm, there is also, for better or for worse, I'm going to play devil's advocate on this. Interesting choice of words, but there's if the people so if the people whom you're wanting to have them do a thing
Mm-hmm.
are superstitious, and you can make them believe that you have power, then if you go stare at them and then tell them to go do something illegal for you, they might just do it
They
because
might just do it to avoid a more harsh fate.
yes. Hubbard says that several years ago he was living on a farm he owned in Lincoln County when word came to him that Edwards, the same man now awaiting punishment, had hoodooed his two daughters. He sold his farm, went to his daughter's home, and by his own hoodoo powers found the toe ball. It was in one of the daughter's shoes, in which were placed the necessary herbs. Hubbard removed the herbs and the toe ball, thus being separated and burned. The daughter recovered from consumption, he says, and today is a healthy woman. The toe ball, under whose charm the other was held, could not be found, and she soon died.
Certainly, we give that impression, especially since the co-conspirator had died of consumption, and the story involves consumption. It certainly could generate quite the buzz in the community that would be likely to believe this.
Yes. Edwards admits having hoodoo powers and says the African Americans living near him were all afraid of him. It is the Negroes' belief that Edwards hoodooed Henderson and Castillo and forced them to assist in the crime. Henderson confessed to the murder, saying he had no reason for committing it other than that Edwards commanded him.
Always easy to say. I was just following orders.
Or even worse, not just following orders, but I had no choice.
Exactly. Yeah.
And from a on the ground social context, the idea that give this poor guy the benefit of the doubt, the idea that the co-conspirators, from their belief structure, it might not have been any different for them than if somebody was literally holding a gun to their back.
Yes, and that's the thing is, again, contextually for them, it probably was the same as if someone walked up and put a gun to your head and said, "Do this," or "I pull the trigger."
Yes, and of course this was now again devil's advocate, but this was pre-modern medicine. Individuals dying of tuberculosis all over the place, and that threat existing in which a loved one could easily contract a contagious disease and die in very short order. It was certainly happening all across the world at that time, but especially so in modern cities because of the congestion of population.
Yes, and we don't think of it today, but during that time period, there were a lot of outbreaks of TB in this general area, and so that could be a very real fear for people. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Now, shifting away for a moment, black magic or nefarious magic, or I don't know, what do you want to call it? Magic with the intent to harm for whatever reason.
There you go.
And it could be justice. It could be they were having a bad day. It could be all sorts of reasons, but just as that blanket structure. What are some of your thoughts, and or perhaps even first-hand experience or recollection experience, that sort of thing?
I mean, and again, because this is so rare, it doesn't come up very often. I'm really trying to think of personal experiences or cases that I dealt with that I could really label that way. I mean, I've had a couple of clients in cases over the years in paranormal situations where they thought they had been cursed. and to be honest, in those particular cases, my feeling at the end of the day was they probably weren't.
Mhm.
Uh, just a combination of other things. I certainly think there is the possibility, particularly if you have the victim who believes in it.
Mhm.
It's kind of like the studies of zombies in Haiti, that they use a certain poison from a fish there that puts people basically in a trance, that their body functions slow down so much they seem dead, but it affects them. They become very susceptible, and so to suggestion, and so they end up feeling like they have to follow these directions from the voodoo priest that's turning them into a zombie. And so I think you can have that same sort of process if you already are susceptible to that belief, um, with a higher level of fear of it than normal, um, that you can end up falling into that situation, and how much of it's the victim and how much of it's the practitioner, I think it becomes the question.
Yeah, yeah. At the end of the day, there is a really interesting, interplay
Mm-hmm.
between people.
Yeah,
Often not with the best of intentions.
very true. Very true. And perhaps that is a part of the crux of black magic, is that the interaction of people and their intentions, and is it manifested or not.
Yes, yes. And I think perhaps, really at the end of the day, this is one of those things that sometimes there are no easy answers.
No. No, there aren't.
And the final verdict is it depends.
Yes. Hey, you're still sounding like a lawyer today.
And I haven't even made it very far through my Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil by Joan Barrett that I got at Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri.
There you go. Hey, what a segue. Hmm. Well, that would be a good place to stop for today.
Sounds good. This is a fun topic. We actually have more material that we may cover soon in the upcoming months. On this, we do welcome individuals' experiences, thoughts, opinions. Regardless of where you all might land on this, we're interested to hear what you have to say.
Exactly, we do. The discussion is the important thing, I think.
I agree. It's a lot of fun and sometimes very, very helpful.
It is. So we thank everybody. Hope everyone has a good week, and we'll see you next week.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everyone.